Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel on the United Nations at 75. I'm Dr. Ken Conca. I'm a professor of international relations here in the School of International Service at American University. We're quite excited to do this panel today. We've got a distinguished group of experts, and we're looking forward to a really rich conversation. The UN has gone through many changes since its creation in 1945. It was founded by a group of 51 member states. Today, the membership is nearly 4 times that number. It was a different era at that time and with different concerns. If you read the UN Charter, you'll notice that many of the terms that we use routinely in discussing today's world affairs, words like globalization, sustainability, gender, climate change, they're not found in the text of the United Nations Charter. It was a different time. But when we think about the goals that the founders set out quite clearly in the UN Charter, peace and security, human rights, international law, economic development, we can see the work of the organizations very much unfinished, and those goals are as urgent and compelling today as they were 75 years ago. So to make sense of where the UN's been and where it's going, we're fortunate to have a distinguished panel with us today. Before I bring them on, a quick program note. This discussion will last for about 45 minutes with 15 minutes at the end for question and answer. If you'd like to ask a question, please submit it through the question and answer function at the bottom of the Zoom window. Answers to questions won't be typed into the Q&A function, but the closed captions will include all of the responses. Also, we ask that no one record this session. We'll be recording the webinar, and it will be available on the SIS YouTube channel for those who'd like to watch it again, or for anyone who may have missed the event. And with that, I'd like to bring on our panelists. Our first participant is James Cunningham. Jim is a former US ambassador to the United Nations, Israel, and Afghanistan. As a senior member of the US Foreign Service, Ambassador Cunningham also served as Chief of Staff to the NATO Secretary General. He currently is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and he teaches at Syracuse University's Maxwell School. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Our second panelist is Kate Dodson. Kate is Vice President of Global Health at the United Nations Foundation, where she works to build synergies among a range of partners on global health challenges. Kate is also chair of the board of the Global Health Council, and she's a co-lead for the COVID-19 Solidarity Response Fund of the World Health Organization. Kate, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here, Ken. Thanks.
Our third panelist is Dr. Mahmoud Mohaldin. Mahmoud is United Nations Special Envoy on Financing for the 2030 Agenda. Dr. Mohaldin is an economist by training with more than 30 years of experience in international finance and development. He previously served as a senior vice president at the World Bank, where his portfolio included relations with the United Nations organizations, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals. Mahmoud, it's wonderful to have you with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor. Thank you.
And rounding out our panel is Rachel Pittman. Rachel is the executive director of the United Nations Association of the United States of America. UNA USA is a grassroots advocacy movement with over 20,000 members. Rachel guides their strategic work and leads advocacy efforts to help the United States advance the UN's goals. And I have to say, I'm delighted to note that she's actually a graduate of American University, having earned her degree in international business from our own Kogod School of Business. So it's always great to have an Eagle who's doing great things in the world back on campus. So welcome, Rachel. We're delighted to have you with us today.
Nice to be here.
So let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to toss out a question for all 4 panelists and just get a brief sense of your view of the current situation. How would you describe the state of the United Nations on its 75th anniversary? Jim, let's start with you.
Well, thank you. I think it's safe to say that the United Nations is struggling a bit these days, but that's a function of the global situation and the actions and policies of the major players in the UN system. We're in a world filled with strife and political difference at the moment between the United States, our international partners, other players in the world, Russia, China. We have conflicts all over the place. And of course, there is the overriding challenge right now of COVID. So it's a very stressful environment. And that makes things stressful for the UN as well. they have a big job to do, and they're trying to do it, and we should be helping them do that.
Kate, your thoughts?
I think they're pretty consistent with Jim's. I would characterize the UN right now as misunderstood and beleaguered, and given the geopolitical context that Jim spoke about. But ultimately, I think proving itself indispensable, especially in this crisis, but beyond that. I mean, millions of people living in humanitarian crisis contexts rely on the UN to help save their lives. And so its indispensability is indisputable, to use two big words there. But and it, the UN is still playing an invisible hand in some of the essential parts of our everyday experience, places where we don't realize, like food security for food that crosses borders, and of course the race for a future COVID vaccine and other countermeasures to end this pandemic. The UN is at the forefront of. So its role is still indispensable, despite the fact that it is misunderstood, misperceived, I think, and that erosion of understanding is more acute now than probably ever, and a bit beleaguered by this political context.
Mahmoud, as someone who is already facing the moderately daunting task of standing up the Sustainable Development Goals and financing them and implementation and so on, and we'll drill into the SDGs in just a moment, but how would you describe the current state of the UN?
Well, I agree with the previous speakers. There are many challenges since the creation of the UN, and in difficult times, it had proven itself useful for the humanity, supporting many actions. Some of them are visible, some of them are, as mentioned by Kate, are invisible. I would say as well, depending on the area, because when you describe the charter and the mandate of the UN, it really varies from issues related to peace, security, matters related to development, humanitarian support, and human rights and other matters. And here you can really see, depending on the surrounding environment, the kind of change, the ability of partnerships to do their trick and contribute to the effectiveness and the efficiency of the UN, we see the success. And a few days ago, we all celebrated the Peace Prize for the World Food Program, which I think in its justification why it has been awarded, it's not just for the good friends at the World Food Program, whom I worked with for many years when I was at the bank in the humanitarian development work, but stands for many of those who are doing something similar in the field in very exceptional circumstances to deliver under severe political and security situations.
Yes, and I hope we'll be able to unpack some of that, because you're right, it really is a multifaceted undertaking as we proceed. Rachel, as someone who's working from the grassroots and working within the United States to try to promote the UN effectiveness, how would you describe the current state of the UN on its 75th anniversary?
Well, first of all, there's nothing like a pandemic to mark the UN's 75th anniversary. I think that the state of global cooperation, tells us a lot, and it also reflects the state of the UN. I think there's good news and bad news. The bad news is, our economy is in huge jeopardy and going towards a recession. Everything that we are doing to advance the SDGs is taking a big hit. And all the work around issues such as climate change or climate action and gender equality, once again, is in jeopardy. And then the support from the UN, especially from the US administration, is taking a backseat, which is hurting the UN. But on the flip side, the good side, and I'm sure Kate will tell us all later, WHO is doing a lot of great work in bringing countries together and looking at how we can produce that vaccine that will be distributed to everyone everywhere and not just the rich. And WFP, the World Food Program, just got a Nobel Prize. So there's a lot of still good things, and we know that the UN is absolutely needed today. And I'm hoping people will realize that global cooperation is so important.
It's interesting to note that we hear about the World Health Organization in the American presidential campaign. We hear about the Paris Agreement in the presidential campaign. Beyond that, we don't hear much about the refugee crisis, the other circumstances that the UN is grappling with. This has been an unusual campaign for many reasons. And of course, that brings me to COVID. The COVID-19 pandemic is precisely the sort of threat to both to international peace and stability, and also to the global public good, anti-poverty programs, development, gender equity across the agenda, exactly the kind of problem the UN was created to address. Kate, what would you say, as someone who's worked centrally on this, what would you say we've learned about the UN from the way it's responded to the ongoing crisis? What's working and where are the gaps?
Well, thanks, Ken. It's a great question, and there are a lot of directions we could take it, so I'll try to be concise. And, you know, the Secretary General has called this probably the most acute crisis that the UN has ever faced. And as Rachel said, it is rather ironic that it's happening. It's in 75th year to be tested so fundamentally. And it has required a multidimensional, multifaceted response from the UN, including providing social service protection, protection from gender-based violence, some economic support to hardest hit communities. I mean, the response that the UN has had to bring forward is unprecedented. But to focus on a couple of quick insights on, you know, what's working and what's not from my perch, working most closely with the World Health Organization, I think the fundamental lesson of the UN that we're learning this year is that the UN and its specialized agencies are only as strong as member states allow it to be. Take the international health regulations. That's the global treaty that binds all member states to self-report on pathogens and outbreaks of pandemic potential. It doesn't allow WHO enough autonomy to call out member states who fail to report. And that's because governments wanted to limit it. WHO's authority in the early 2000s when they designed the IHRs. That's a gap, and one that there seems to be growing support for from many corners to address by strengthening these international health regulations. It's a slog, and given the geopolitical context that we're in, we might wind up opening a Pandora's box and with a worse, revised multilateral arrangement than we have now. But there seems to be kind of an urgency that's displaying itself to try to address that gap, that fundamental gap in pandemic preparedness. But there's also plenty that's working. I mean, Rachel hit on a little bit of this already. A couple of highlights that I would point out from my vantage point on the UN's health response. First is fixing the global supply chain for health commodities. We all recall from the spring how challenging it was from our own communities to get access to personal protective equipment, tests, and testing kits. That played out in virtually every community in the world. Virtually every aspect of the supply chain for personal protective equipment and tests, from raw materials to manufacturing all the way through distribution and logistics, had to be rebuilt on a massive scale. And WHO and the World Food Program were right at the center of that. Working with a range of other partners, they set up a new global supply chain system in April. Since then, massive global procurement of PPE, lowering prices, stabilizing the market, combined with effective distribution, largely through air freight run by the World Food Program. Since May, more than 200 million pieces of PPE have been distributed to 120 countries. That's a huge amount of innovation in action for scale. The second, as Rachel mentioned, is about the global coordinated effort to massively accelerate the process of R&D, manufacturing, allocation, and distribution of new vaccines, tests, and treatments to end the acute phase of this pandemic. WHO is at the center of that through a multifaceted partnership called the ACT Accelerator. It's novel. It's never been tried before to get from a novel pathogen, one never before seen in the history of the earth, a new vaccine for it, not only developed, but licensed for safety, manufactured at scale, distributed at scale, as many as 2 billion doses by the end of 2021, if we all play our cards right. That's an unprecedented level of scale, of global cooperation at scale. And I think that's one of the things that the UN is doing right. It's showing itself nimble, dynamic, and meeting the needs where the needs are in this pandemic.
And it's a reminder on the 75th anniversary. It's interesting, when the General Assembly recently passed a resolution acknowledging the moment, they pointed to combating disease as one of the great achievements of the UN across its history, along with a few other elements, colonization and humanitarian action and a few other items. And it's a real reminder to us, I think, of that sort of, day-to-day presence in the lives of people in many places around the world that we don't ever want to forget. But I do want to turn to the question of some of the larger political divisions of the current moment. Jim, as someone with ambassadorial experience in dealing with those divisions, in dealing with the diplomacy, in dealing with the geopolitical interests, how do those interests and divisions among key member states shape what the UN is or is not able to do on COVID?
Well, it's as Kate said, it's a fundamental factor because the UN is not an independent actor. It can only do what its member states, and particularly its more important member states, empower it or encourage it to do and enable it to do by providing resources and guidance. When it works well, it's a partnership. The UN is both a forum for partnership, but it's also a partner with other countries in addressing crises, whether it's a security threat or COVID or whatever the issue is. And when its principal members are quarreling with each other and have divergent views of how to proceed, its ability to get a particular job done is limited. And when they're united or brought together, its efficiency and capability are very much enhanced. It's a real shame that we're having disputes between the United States and other countries about empowering the WHO, for instance, which is doing a lot of good things, whatever happened at the outset of the crisis. I was honored to be at the UN, ambassador to the UN, when the Security Council took on the issue of AIDS. That was a groundbreaking event that nobody remembers anymore. But I remember very well the political process that led up to that. Most countries did not want to have anything to do with AIDS. It was American leadership that brought it to the Security Council and energized and empowered the UN community to begin coordinating a response to it. We Americans ought to be doing the same thing with COVID. And what I would ask the American public to imagine is, what would this world look like without the UN and everything it's doing for COVID, for refugees, for threatened people, for people who are starving around the world because of the phase that we're going through right now. The world would be an immeasurably more difficult and dangerous place than it is now, because in part of what the UN is able to do, all its flaws notwithstanding.
Key agenda item for the UN in tackling that agenda that Jim just laid out is obviously the Sustainable Development Goals. And Mahmoud, as someone who's been centrally involved, I'd like to ask you, how is the pandemic impacting progress on the SDGs? And not just for health, but across the full range of the aspirations and the goals.
Right. Based on the data and evidence available to us, even before the pandemic, the world was not doing very well. We're very much off track. I'm not talking about exceptional cases for some countries who are already advanced and taking the SDGs very seriously based on their own national programs. But after 5 years of implementation, the kind of signals, especially with some of the critical SDGs, including poverty, extreme poverty, including inequality, SDG 10, matters related to gender, and even countries which did well in those three aspects, they didn't do that well in governance, SDG 16. So that called for some action, and the Secretary General called for a decade of action. That was well before we all stuck by the COVID-19. Of course, after the pandemic, which is basically a kind of characterization and assessment on how bad we were prepared in one of the goals, which is basically about health, SDG 3, about the readiness of primary health systems, even in many advanced economies, called us really to take the SDGs into a different way. How can we use SDGs as part of the solution in the emergency response, in the matters related to building back better? Of course, here we are not really in an equal world. So some countries are happy to say building back better, but some countries, as reminded by the managing director of the IMF, saying better say building forward better, because what happened in the past of inequality, of lack of inclusion, of discrepancy in matters related to compromises when it comes to climate and environment needs us to be doing a better job. So it's easier to articulate a model about it or a framework, but we're very much engaged at the UN. The two prime ministers of Canada and Jamaica and the Secretary General of the UN convened a process, started with heads of state meeting on the 28th of May. And this shows you something about the convening power of the UN. Even in the middle of a crisis, you managed to have 50 heads of state attending a meeting calling for action for the emergency, for the recovering and the restructuring, and for matters related to climate and sustainability. We went into a process. The process itself is an example of the power of the UN if it is enabled to do what it should be doing. As Ambassador Cunningham mentioned, in this case, we're lucky. Everybody was supporting. So we were able to unleash the capacity of the UN to convene member states, international organizations, 25 units of the UN. And we had another meeting during the General Assembly with another 50 heads of state agreeing on actions when it matters to finance, additional finance, debt management and debt restructuring. And just to remind you that the Secretary General was among the first to call not just for the debt service suspension, as we supported coming from the G20 and the IFIs, the World Bank and the IMF, but for major debt restructuring and for considering seriously a new debt architecture, which is supported now by the IMF. Matters related to finance, debt, and prevention of illicit financial flows. It's really a waste of time to talk about additional finance or dealing with debt to support the SDGs while there is a major leakage in the system through the illicit financial flows. And the figures that came out recently from UNCTAD, one of the UN entities, saying that Africa alone is losing $90 billion a year, which is sufficient to cover more than half of the requirements for the SDGs in Africa. No need of aid, no need of more finance, but just to keep the money to themselves and reinvest it in their own countries. And then we can talk about ODA, which is essential, especially for the fragile and post-conflict countries. We can talk about investments coming from abroad to these countries. But I think the framework of the Finance for Development, the Addis Agenda, the SDGs, and the Paris Agreement, all of them were put in dealing with the crisis as part of the solution and looking beyond the crisis management. Of course, issues related to health that Kate mentioned are very much in the center of all of that. But while we're at it, we need to make sure that building the systems either back better or forward better, but we need to have major restructuring of systems.
So given the convergence of these challenges, almost a sort of a perfect storm of crises with global recession, with COVID, with the pre-existing challenges to implementing the SDGs that Mahmoud was talking about. Rachel, I wonder whether COVID feels like a turning point. I'd like to ask you to focus specifically on the US-UN relationship as someone who's really got her finger on the pulse of that. With the US as politically polarized as it is today, do you think it's possible to forge a consensus? We've heard that the organization is only as strong as the member states will allow it to be. And so in the context of this member state, is it possible to forge a consensus on what we want the UN to be able to do in current American politics?
Yes, and to kind of speak to what Mahmoud just said, recently at a high-level financing development meeting, the UN Secretary General said that unless we take action now, we are obviously facing a global recession, and we're going to wipe out decades of development, and the 2030 agenda is going to be at far reach. And the U.S. is, aware of this situation, yet they had said that, we're terminating our relationship with WHO. We are ending our funding with WHO. And I just think when we take a look back, we're going to be on the wrong side of history. And it's interesting to your question, Ken. My sister organization, Better World Campaign, just conducted their annual poll on US perspectives on the UN. And 85% of those polled who are voters, they looked at voters, believe that it's very important or somewhat important for the US to be involved in the UN. And to speak to you, James, 73% of the voters say that the UN is still needed. And it's needed, the respondents agreed it's needed because the UN is strong with multilateral engagement and preventing wars and resolving conflicts and promoting peace. And so it's our job at UNAUSA to make sure that people understand the importance of global cooperation and the work that the UN does, and that we're all interconnected and that we all need to work together so that our children have a future. So yes, to your question.
So that brings me to the question of institutional reform. And I'd like to ask Jim to take the start on this. We've seen several cycles of proposals to reform the UN, going back a few decades now at least, including most recently Secretary General Guterres' United to Reform program, which, as our panelists know, has a three-part agenda on security, on management, and on development reforms. Jim, based on your experience, what are the principal obstacles to improving organizational effectiveness in the political sphere?
Well, there are multiple obstacles, as you can see from the fact that every Secretary General, at least in my experience, which goes back to the 1980s, every Secretary General comes into office with a renewed reform agenda, because reform hasn't succeeded. And I'm not talking about reform of the Security Council. That's a qualitatively different issue. I'm talking about principally reform about and how the UN does its business, how its personnel system is organized, how services are delivered, and all that sort of thing. So some of the obstacles are internal. Organizations resist change, and some of the best people in the world work for the UN, but there's also a resistance among the UN personnel itself to be told by nations, by outsiders, how to do their business, and that's a natural phenomenon. The nations, however, feel that they have a perfectly legitimate and even necessary need to be able to shape how the UN does business on their behalf. So there's kind of an inherent conflict there. Even if you agree on the goals. The other obstacle to reform is lack of agreement on the goals. One person's efficiency is another person's intrusion into either issues of national policy or sovereignty or priorities in the organization. And it's not very often the case. I didn't myself participate in many of the UN committee discussions about this sort of thing, but we had an ambassador created when I went to the UN in 1999. We created a ambassador's position who was responsible only for management and reform, and made a major effort to try to improve how the UN does business. Sometimes that effort was appreciated, oftentimes it was not. But the fact is that the member states themselves have a great deal of difficulty coming together around an agenda that they can agree on and work with the Secretary General to implement. So I think it's fair to say there has been progress, but as with many things, including in every government, it's a work in progress. You have to keep at it, and it's just a fact of life. You can't expect any organization to be perfect or to align itself, even with a member state as powerful as the United States. You can't expect the organization simply to align itself with a set of goals that you put out there. It takes work to implement.
So given that fragmentation that you described, and certainly we see that around the Security Council, where virtually every member of the United Nations is on record as saying that there needs to be reform of the Council, but obviously no consensus on what the elements and goals of that reform would be. I wonder if there's a danger that the day-to-day and on-the-ground absolutely essential activities that Kate was describing earlier get lost in some sense in the reform conversation. And Kate, I'd like to ask you to speak to that. Is there a danger in the higher level political conversation about reform, which tends to focus on the political interests of powerful states, on the budget, on questions around accountability of the bureaucracy, et cetera? Is there a danger that some of the core capabilities and functions that you were describing earlier get lost? How do we keep them central to that reform conversation?
So I think it is a challenge and a real possibility that member states will just focus on addressing today's problems rather than anticipating tomorrow's. And when calling for reform, not take forward and take into account some of those intended or unintended consequences on the core capabilities of the UN. But I think it's helpful to look at where reform has made a positive difference. And in the global health security space, we learned a lot after the West Africa Ebola outbreak a handful of years ago, where there were really resounding calls for reform of how WHO in particular and other parts of the UN system addressed health crises like that regional epidemic. And those reforms worked. They were smart, effective, and well done, if slightly incomplete, because I don't think that member states had their eyes sufficiently on tomorrow's problems, which are now, frankly, today's, when going through this reform process just 5 years ago. And the world is better off. This pandemic response has been smarter and sharper because of how member states and enlightened leadership at the UN level took on and embraced reform to make a smarter World Health Emergencies program, for instance. Looking forward, it's still, I think, too early to tell in terms of what calls for further reform of the pandemic architecture at the UN will look like and what will build traction over time. Plenty of member states, France and Germany, the United States, Chile, South Korea have proposals under development, independent efforts, including one established after the West Africa Ebola outbreak called the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, and also the newly created independent panel on pandemic preparedness and response, which was called for by member states at the World Health Assembly this past May. Their recommendations are, they still have to coalesce and come together. So it remains to be seen whether core capacities will be eroded. What we're seeing out of some of them are really, again, smart, sharp ideas, but they may distort human resource or budget priorities away from core capabilities. And I think it'll take a lot of attention and due diligence by leadership at the UN, as well as member states who are keen for more of a strengthening agenda rather than necessarily a reform agenda in order to make sure that comes to pass.
Thanks. Mahmoud, I wonder about the development system and its positioning in the reform. Secretary General Guterres' reform plan focused specifically on what he described as repositioning the UN development system. What does that mean in your experience? What are the main elements and strategy behind that repositioning?
Well, that reform of the development system that started in the implementation back in January 2019 was perhaps motivated by the same kind of goals and objectives that Ambassador Cunningham and Kate talked about. But it had additional motivations because you are talking about a 2030 development agenda. So everybody was asking, especially member states, are you fit for purpose? Are you able to support countries, especially in need, to do a better job in implementing the SDGs based on the success and experience in the field? Can you do a better job? And of course, there were some anticipated crises, including some further budget constraints facing the system that pushed for this kind of reform. So I think when the Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed called it, it's the most ambitious reform program, as at least for the development system of the UN. She was very much right, because that started in implementation of some major restructuring from within the system, with all of the issues that you would expect from a big organization to happen as reaction to these reforms. So on the elements of that, the changes in the resident coordinators system and their reporting lines, with better alignment with the regional economic commissions, with the agencies in the headquarters. And it's good now that everybody is reading from the same reference about the goals and the targets and how to help the countries achieving them. There is a lot of work as well on matters related to accountability, issues related to budgets and funding and partnerships. So I think, and there are other elements of these reforms. The beauty of them, that they are easier to trace and easier to present and to check what is happening. And I think the system has been now tested severely with the crisis, because all of the elements and units of the UN system need to deliver. And as we have seen it in the past and even currently, and again, with good reference to our World Food Program colleagues, that the system works better under pressure. So when you see this kind of call that there is no time to waste, there is no bureaucracy to protect, but you need to be after an action, I've seen a better job by pushing the reform system to deliver in the field.
It's interesting as you're speaking, the questions and answers, the Q&A questions are starting to come in, and this is a good opportunity for me to remind our audience that if you have a question, please use the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of the Zoom window, and type your question in, and we'll get to as many as we can. We'll be turning to that in just a few moments. But the first question that popped up on my screen was about financing, very much in the context of some of the elements that Mahmoud was discussing. So we'll be dipping into that in just a moment. Rachel, I wanted to ask you what the reform agenda looks like from the grassroots and from the perspective of your organization and your local chapters. What are you hearing and seeing in terms of the direction and the goals that reform needs to take?
So this past year, UNA USA participated in the Secretary General's UN 75 initiative, which was asking everyone around the world to have conversations about global challenges. And the goal of the UN 75 initiative is looking at the gap between the future we want and where we're headed if current trends continue. So UNA USA, we hosted 80 consultations and brought voices from all 50 states, DC and Puerto Rico. And one of the questions was, what actions should the UN take in order to secure a better future? And there were 4 areas that popped out. One was around advocacy of global issues. So they're wanting the UN to encourage member states to use the SDGs to improve their nations. They wanted the UN to promote specific issues like climate change, inequality, human rights, peacekeeping, etc. The second area was inclusive engagement. So that's where the UN should be using initiatives to focus more on youth, community, grassroots organizations and more corporate cooperation. The third was policy coordination and accountability, where the UN continued to work with world leaders to resolve differences and encourage cooperation, make them more accountable for the SDGs and enforce treaties that had been signed onto. And the last one had to do with marketing and education, where the UN, as we go into the future, should encourage more schools to incorporate in their curriculum information about the UN. A lot of students and youth still don't understand the ins and outs of the UN, and this is so important. And then just marketing, just do better at just promoting all the good work that the UN does, and do it through social media and other marketing venues. So those were the things that came out of the global consultations that we did.
Terrific. And this is maybe a good chance to flag the fact that your organization typically generates a briefing book, advice for the next administration, an agenda for the next administration. And so I'll encourage people to hit the UNA USA website and watch for that. I don't know if it's up yet or if it's
our
available
briefing book, it's up on unausa.org's site. And you're right. I mean, we use this up on Capitol Hill, and this year it was through Zoom meetings with our members of Congress to talk about the important work of the UN and why U.S. funding, full U.S. funding for the UN is needed now more than ever.
Perfect. So for our audience members can certainly note to look for that. We're almost to the Q&A, but I'd like to toss out one more question, and perhaps we can do this in just a sort of a rapid fire, ask each of you to keep your answer to a minute or less, but we can't leave this conversation at American University without talking about the relationship between the United States and the UN. It's fundamental to the organization's effectiveness, but it's sometimes fraught, and it's certainly seen its ups and downs, not only through the last several presidential administrations, but also through the last several secretaries general as well. And so I'd like each of you to just reflect briefly on what's the essential take-home message about what each side must do to strengthen that relationship, to improve that relationship, and to make it work more effectively for the global public good. Jim?
It's an interesting question. I think, unfortunately, it's easy for American administrations, Democratic and Republican, to scapegoat the UN or to try to marginalize it because it's viewed as being inefficient or an unworkable partner. That's a very short-sighted view. So I think what American administrations need to realize is that the United Nations isn't perfect, yes, but it's an invaluable partner that can do an incredible range of things when our goals and objectives are aligned. And the flip side of that for the UN is that, as I said earlier, many of the people who work in the UN system are incredibly motivated, dedicated people. It's in their interest and the organization's interest to try to have a strong working relationship with the United States, which still, although we haven't been doing it recently, unfortunately, but is still the most powerful force for realizing the goals set out in the UN Charter. And I'm glad you mentioned that at the outset. The UN Charter basically reflects an American view shared by many, many other people around the world for how the world ought to be organized. And we should all be taking advantage of that.
Kate?
Yeah, I'll be brief. It's a great question. And I think it's not just about administrations in the United States, it's about Congress too. Rachel hit on this. Members of Congress have a highly varied understanding of the UN, and many suffer from misperceptions about its role and function. So the first step for American policymakers is to look beyond the political rhetoric and really understand how the UN works and what value it adds to not only billions of people around the world, but Americans and their own constituents in their own districts as well. It's our experience that when policymakers do that, the trust in the UN's work grows. And I think that's a key insight. On the UN side, I would argue that there's largely, for some of the reasons Jim already noted, a strong understanding of how the US works, not only because of the strong partnership that the US has had with the UN over its years, but if, an ongoing commitment to transparency by the UN, accountability to performance, mitigating its own tendencies to scope creep, mission creep, and kind of sharp budget management, some of the kind of building blocks that Mahmoud was talking about earlier, not only will further engender the trust of the US and American policymakers, but other member states as well. So it's good practice anyway.
Mahmoud, not asking you to speak for the UN or to make news headlines here, but any thoughts just in your own personal capacity, your own experience about strengthening that relationship?
Well, I think we're building a very good history and good relations that had been accumulating nicely during the years since the establishment of the UN and the invitation by the US for the UN to be established on an American soil, and with all of this kind of support that the UN has been having in terms of capacity, flexibility, different support, and not just the budget. We shouldn't really forget that the US is the biggest single contributor to the UN budget. But it's actually the environment of freedom, of liberty, of providing access that we shouldn't really be taking this kind of complicated world always for granted. So I think we need really to build on what we have and hope for the better.
Rachel, final thought on that question about strengthening the relationship? I know you've thought about it.
Quickly, US needs to pay our bills as great nations do. That means UN peacekeeping budget and our regular budget. And then we need to activate on what I call the 3 R's. We need to rejoin those agencies we left: WHO, UNESCO, Human Rights Council, et cetera. We need to re-enter treaties such as the Paris Agreement. And we need to restore funding to agencies such as the UN Population Fund, funding for Palestinian refugees, among others.
Terrific.
And then for the UN, I'm sorry, on the UN side, continue to streamline operations and control costs, I would say.
Terrific. Well, the questions are starting to come in, so let's turn to our Q&A portion. And the first question picks up, I think, on both Mahmoud and Rachel's response. Is there a more sustainable way to finance the work of the United Nations? Should there be a tax? Mahmoud, perhaps you could speak first to financing, either in the context of the SDGs or more generally. And I may also ask Kate to chime in a little bit on this if she has thoughts about the funding side. Please.
Okay. Yeah, we need to distinguish between two things, between financing development, including the global public goods that are required to be supported by some sort of global finance, and doing development at the national and local level, which is another issue. So here, in the past, there have been lots of proposals about how to make finance more sustainable, including the financial transaction taxes, and part of that could be put to the service of international organization. Of course, that had been always met by resistance. I think the modalities which exist today, with some sort of good burden sharing and sharing costs, and especially with the new rising stars in the world economy, if they start to take some fair share of the responsibility in this kind of fast changing world, that could be more realistic than assuming something like a global tax to be allocated for funding global public goods or preventing global public debt. When it comes to development finance in the field, this is the whole mix of the finance for development agenda when it comes to public-private partnerships, domestic and external support, in addition to issues that have been reflected nicely in the Addis agenda, which needs a lot of support itself, as you know.
Kate, thoughts on the finance side?
I'll just raise a couple of smaller or shorter points. One is that I think the UN is a mix, right? There are plenty of parts of the UN system that are only financed through voluntary contributions from member states and donors. That winds up largely being targeted at ODA budgets for wealthier countries, plus some mix of, philanthropies and others. And then some are financed with assessed contributions, the kind of, mandatory dues, part of the UN budget, part of, larger organizations like the World Health Organization. But I think the challenge is part of the financing is really in the category of the former, that the UN has been forced to kind of compete for ODA budgets. And that's a small slice of money in order to finance essential global public goods. And I think you're stuck in a kind of a pigeonhole when you're stuck in an ODA budget scenario, whereas the UN is about security, it's about health security, it's about economic development and growth. It's about so much more than what what policymakers may conventionally define as ODA. And if we can break that mold and help high income countries who are generous donors like the US to the UN, think about the UN as more than just kind of a charitable donation as part of ODA, then I think we may unlock more resources.
Next question, and I'll just throw it open to any panelists that may wish to answer, comes from a very different direction, but I must say I love this question. What recent UN stories would you like to see made into a series on Netflix?
I mean, I think there's so much great work that's being done on the ground. The staff of WHO having coordination with the World Food Program and UNICEF, and just being able to show people on the grounds and the impact that they're making on people's lives, and in order to help them through the pandemic. So I'd like to see those stories in Netflix. And of course, you have to add in a love story to make it more interesting.
Yeah, if I may just add to what Rachel mentioned, there is great deal of stories in the humanitarian work. We have seen them recently. Some of them could be boring when it comes to prevention, but when it comes to disaster management, disaster risk management, and rescuing people, as we have seen it recently in Yemen, in South Sudan, in northeast of Nigeria, in Somalia, and in different parts of the Middle East, and more recently as well in Myanmar, lots of great stories here that had all of the, I'm not a novelist or a script writer for these purposes, but it is really astonishing to see what is really there that you can really report and share to the world. And this part of the communication as well.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that, and I'll just take the chair's prerogative for 1 second to note that I've done a lot of work over the years with the UN Environment Program, the post-disaster and post-conflict branch of the UN, trying to add an environmental and sustainability and building back or forward, as you say, better element to disaster recovery and to post-conflict recovery. And some of the work that's done there on a very small budget is actually quite extraordinary. And so that would be my Netflix series. Our next question has more of a political orientation. Maybe Jim, I'll ask you to take the first crack at this, and then others if they wish to. How do we evaluate Russia, China, and Cuba taking seats on the Human Rights Council? And just a bit of context, as we know, the reform from the Commission on Human Rights to the Human Rights Council was meant to widen out that body, to make the populating of that body more accountable to the UN membership as a whole, to go through this sort of universal periodic review process and so on. But as we know, there continue to be controversies about the composition of the Human Rights Council. And it raises a larger question about how can countries work together on this agenda, given how easy it is to get into those sorts of political controversies. Thoughts?
Yeah, well, the Human Rights Council is a sad story, I think, of a body that started out with high ideals and purposes and has been suborned by the very governments that it was meant to encourage to better human rights performance. So I think it says a lot about the feelings of the Human Rights Council that the only country that was deemed unworthy of membership was Saudi Arabia in this round of elections. And the fact that Cuba and China and Russia both sought membership and were voted in, I think speaks volumes about the failure of that body to be able to do the kinds of things that it's supposed to do. On the other hand, it is a place where countries, governments, and their representatives can discuss human rights issues, but it gets harder and harder to do that when you have the very subjects of that discussion cooperating together to prevent such discussions from happening in any meaningful sense.
I don't know if any of our, please.
Jim,
please,
I would just say this is the prime reason, a perfect example of what happens when the U.S. takes a back seat and doesn't lead and decides to remove themselves from the council. This is exactly what happened. So,
yeah, that could well be. I'm not addressing whether we should be in it or not. I'm just saying that.
No, I understand. I'm just making a point that our voice isn't being heard because we're not there.
Yeah, fair enough.
Kate, please.
I'm going to make the same point as Rachel, so I'm glad she made it.
Terrific. Well, let me, I'm watching the clock, and in the interest of time, let me toss out as a last question and maybe ask each of you to just give a sort of a 30-second response. What gives you hope when you look to the future of the UN? Mahmoud, perhaps we could begin with you.
Right. I think the question after 75 years, and you see with the same energy, people are interested in the UN, people are talking about a new UN, a reimagined UN, as the Secretary General mentioned, within this new framework that we've been talking about, new multilateralism, fast changing world. This gives one really hope that what will come, especially if we capitalize on what we should be learning from the current crisis better, I think that gives me hope. The recent recognition of colleagues at the field represented by the World Food Programme, by the Nobel Peace Prize is another one. The third kind of good work that I see at the headquarters in connection with the field in a very seamless way, trying to apply all of what the Secretary General, the DSG, and the system have been talking about a new UN, more effective and more meaningful support where it really counts, gives me hope.
Rachel.
I think being able to see firsthand the UN's impact on vulnerable populations, also working with thousands of Americans who believe in the vital work of the UN and wanting to see it thrive. And then for me at UNA USA, seeing our chapters grow across the US, particularly campus chapters. And my hope is that the UNA USA American University chapter will be revitalized. So that's my biggest hope.
Hear, hear. Students on the call who are interested in that should reach out to me and to Rachel as well, but certainly to me. And that's something that should be in the works. Kate.
Well, Mahmoud said earlier that the UN performs best in crisis. And I do think we've seen really smart, nimble, dynamic, and rapid leadership by the UN in the context of this pandemic. And that gives me hope that parts of the UN system that may be prone to bureaucracy can rise up above that, get through that noise, and find effective forms of collaboration and partnership to get stuff done. And I think that shows relevance for the UN that gives me hope for its future.
Jim, last word.
Yeah, I think what gives me hope is that the actual good work that the UN is doing is seen and recognized when it comes down to it by, I think, the majority of governments and people in the world. And if we didn't have it, we'd be struggling mightily to invent it, and we don't have to do that. We have it. We just need to collectively make better use of it.
Panelists, thank you. We've reached the end of our hour. Appreciate your taking the time. What gives me hope is to hear conversations like this. Thank you. And thanks to our audience for listening. We've now reached the end of our program.